Hey everyone, Once Bitten here. So I wanted to put together a video just to highlight some of the important ways that the ninth edition is different from Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. Um, the ninth age is definitely the spiritual successor of Warhammer Fantasy, especially as it was in 8th edition, and therefore I think most people who play the ninth age are coming from that game system. And for the most part, if you played 8th edition, you could step right into ninth age and start playing games. And the differences that are there, even if you played them wrong, you'd get used to them pretty quickly. It's not a big deal. Nevertheless, I thought it might be helpful for people making that transition to be able to see laid out what some of the bigger changes are. There's no way I can hit everything, so if you notice anything that I miss, and especially if you notice I say anything incorrect that is incorrect, please leave a comment and let me know. So let's go through it. Starting off when building a list, a couple things I noticed is that one, your battle standard bearer now just has the regular point allotment. Usually it's 50 points, and you can choose to use those 50 points for the magic banner and other things. It doesn't matter. So it used to be in Warhammer 8th edition that if you took a magic banner, you couldn't take magic armor. Now you can. If you want to take a magic banner that is over your magic points allotment, you can, but then of course you can't have anything else. So another thing you'll notice when you're building your list is that the pricing structure is a little bit different. There's a set minimum size for a unit, and it'll come at a set cost, and you could divide that out and figure out how much you're paying per model. But sometimes it might be 6.5 points or something like that. And then after that minimum size, every unit, it'll say, well, you can add an additional number of models if you want, and then there's a price per model for that. And sometimes the price per model is different for the initial set of models than it is for the additional models. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes lower, it just depends. So another thing with list building is that whenever you put a character on a mount, they have a combined profile. I've noticed this change really speeds up game. There's less decisions to make about which one are you targeting in combat or whatever. If this character's on a horse, on a chariot, on a monstrous beast, or on a monster itself, it's all one model. Now, if it's on a monster, there are some important distinctions there that's different from everything else. For instance, on a monster, you don't get the benefit from armor and defensive magic armor and stuff like that, ward saves or anything that you put on your character. Um, so that can be really important. You don't want to waste time doing that. When you're on a monster, you're protected by usually higher toughness and a large number of wounds and some kind of innate defense armor save there. Let's see, characters and command models all have what's called the first in rank rule. So if you played 8th edition, the rules were that for almost all the armies, the command group had to go in the front rank, and any characters had to finish out the front rank and then would go in the second rank. Now you can choose between all of your characters and your command models which you want in the front rank and which ones you want behind them. Also, when a character joins a unit, you could put that character in any legal position. But sometimes if the character can reach the unit, let's say it's a long bus formation unit and it touches the back of them, and for it to be able to get into a legal position, it's got to really go well beyond its movement characteristics, well beyond its march move or anything. When that's the case, you have to put them in the nearest legal position. And I really like that because there were several games where people played completely within the rules in 8th edition, where they would just have to touch a unit and then they could just slingshot all the way to the other side of the unit. I mean, they would travel a quarter of the board length, it seemed like. So now you can still move more than your march movement, but at least you have to go to the nearest place. One of the aspects about ninth age that I enjoy so much better than I did 8th edition is the deployment. So when you're starting a game off, you roll a die. Whichever player rolls higher gets to choose gets to choose who chooses sides. And it's important because whoever chooses sides, the other person gets to decide who gets to start deploying first or who has to start deploying first. And that's important because when you deploy, you aren't restricted to deploying just one unit at a time. You can put one unit down, or you could put 3 units down, or you could put your whole army down. It doesn't matter. Whenever the player who finishes deploying first, whenever that person's done, the opponent has to count up the number of units they have left. And that gets as a bonus to the first player's roll to see who gets to go first. So basically, if you deploy your whole army, you're basically saying, I'm going to deploy first, and then I'm going to go first. And so your advantage is you get to go first turn, or you get to deploy knowing how your opponent's deployed. I've played games all over the map with this. I've had it where I've wanted to deploy first. I've had it where, because I wanted to go first, I've had it where I didn't care about going first. It was much more important to me to deploy based on what my opponent did. I've had games where we've gone back and forth one unit at a time for several times, and then somebody said, okay, now I know what I need to know, and they plop the rest of their army down. I've seen all over the place, and it really adds an extra layer of strategy to the game that I find really, really fun. Line of sight has changed. They play a tiered, we in the Ninth Age play a tiered system, so there's no true line of sight. This, for the tournaments that I went to, a lot of those tournaments used a tiered line of sight system anyway, so this isn't that far different from most games that I've played, but it's definitely different than the ways the rules were written in 8th edition. So, say like infantry models are size 1, cavalry models are size 2, monsters cav will be size 3, monsters will be size 4, something like that. And if there's something taller than you in between you and something else, so let's say it's infantry trying to see another infantry, but there's a monster in between, well, you can't see over it. Same thing with terrain, like hills and buildings. They're just really super high. So it doesn't matter what you can really see physically. It matters where those different things are on this tiered system. When there are buildings, you can now march into a building, which is kind of nice because otherwise you had to be so close to the building to be able to get into it. But there is the limitation that for every single model in the unit, it can't go more than triple its movement. So if you're just really super long or wide and it would take just an incredible movement to get over there, you can't do that. In the shooting phase, the rule that 8th edition had called move or fire, there's nothing equivalent to that in the 9th Age. The closest thing to it is now some weapons are classified as unwieldy, which means that if they move, there's an additional -1 to hit modifier. There's always a -1 to hit modifier if you move. Now it would be -2 if you have that kind of weapon. Weapons that have volley fire, like longbows and things like that, they can shoot over other troops without suffering the cover penalty that you would normally get. Normally, troops provide a -2 to hit penalty, and if you have volley fire, you can just ignore that. So it means you can put bowmen behind your lines. And if the unit doesn't move, then the whole unit can shoot instead of just the first 2 ranks. There's no longer any such thing as a lookout sir roll. If a template hits a unit and the template covers a character, it doesn't matter. All the hits get targeted onto rank and file models, assuming that it's the same troop type and there's at least 5 of them and stuff like that. Also with shooting, one of the biggest changes is that cannons no longer shoot the way they did in 8th edition. Now they use ballistic skill. So most cannon crews seem to be ballistic skill 3, meaning that a cannon hits on a 4-up unless modifiers start coming into play. Cannons do ignore some 2-hit modifiers, such as those provided by cover. Then once it hits, then it bounces, and that bounce is a kind of a line template, but they still have to use their ballistic skill to shoot. Also, cannons no longer do D6 wounds, so if you want to target that monster, 1, that monster would be +1 to hit, being a large target. 2, assuming you do wound it, you're going to do D3 +1 wounds. So really you can see they just took out the extremes. Instead of a D6 where you might roll a 1, you might roll a 6, now you're going to get between 2 and 4. If it's a flying anything, then you get to add an extra wound on top of that. Templates such as cannons, but really any, a line template is not limited to just one model per rank or per file as it was in 8th edition. The template hits what it hits. There are actually diagrams in the rulebook that show what the maximum number of models hit by templates can be, which I thought was pretty helpful. There is no more tier-shaped template that Warhammer used to use, the old flame template. Any kind of shooting attack, almost always, every instance I can think of, it always just uses 2d6 hits instead of that template. Magic, there are a lot of differences between 9th Age and Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition. Some of the biggest changes are, one, the spells just aren't as game-changing. I like this so much better. The spells are important. They can really swing a game. I definitely am always tempted to take a Dispel Scroll because there seems like always a spell that's really going to do something I don't want it to do. But a single spell should not change the outcome of a game, as was very often the case in Warhammer. Bonuses to cast are limited. If you're a level 1 or level 2, you're going to get only a +1. If you're level 3 or level 4, you're only going to get a +2. And you'll see a lot fewer ways to increase your bonuses to cast, to increase the number of dice you get. Channeling, you only channel 1 die instead of one die for every spellcaster. Now you channel 1 die and you just get 1 extra pip for every spellcaster. So if you have 1 spellcaster, you'll channel on a 6. If you have 2, you'll channel on a 5. But the most you're going to get is 1 channel dice. When you cast a spell, you're limited to only 5 dice. And when you get overwhelming power, when you cast or dispel, that doesn't mean that the spell is automatically cast, nor that it's automatically dispelled. What it does is that gives you a pretty big bonus, which means it's pretty likely to go, but it still can be dispelled. So if your opponent has a scroll, it doesn't matter if you get up to a 24 on your casting value, because you rolled a couple 6s in there. it can still be dispelled with a scroll, or if they have enough dice or anything like that. And then if you do roll overwhelming power while casting a spell, you have to roll on a miscast table. The results of that table vary based on how many magic dice were used when casting the spell. So if you're throwing 1 or 2 dice at things, nothing too horrible is going to happen. All right, we get to the combat phase. One, when you're trying to get into combat and you're rolling that charge roll, units that have a champion in it always roll at least a 4. So I thought that was an interesting difference between the two game systems. It certainly takes a little bit of the wonkiness out of, when I was playing my old Bretonians in 8th edition and rolled a 1, and a 2 when trying to charge. It was so frustrating. I guess I could still get just 1 more than that, but still, you at least have a minimum of 4. Number 2, when you're trying to get into combat and you charge a unit and they flee, and so you redirect to charge another unit and they flee, in 9th Age, you can still pick either one of those units to complete your charge against. So if they bounce through each other, that used to be a way that it would end up in an automatic failed charge because you couldn't complete a charge against a second fleeing unit. Now you can just say, that's fine, I'll just complete against the first one. When you're in combat, characters can, if they are not in combat to begin with, they can get into combat similar to what Warhammer allowed you to do. But you can only do that with a character who's in the front rank, and he can only do it if he's not already touching an enemy model, and he can only do it to get into combat with a unit that's also in the front rank. So you can't just bounce around the unit wherever you need to be. It makes getting a flank charge that much more important, because if they have just a fantastic fighty character in the front rank and you flank charge him and you're not touching him, he's not going to get to fight until after that round of combat, if they're still around and if they reform. That's the only way he's going to be able to do it. Let's see. Rank and file models can always target rank and file models now. So it used to be you could build a character wall. Ogres and Bretonians did this all the time. You put really tanked up characters in front, and now all the attacks have to go on those characters, and it was very frustrating for people. Now the rank and file models can always target the rank and file models of the other unit. Characters, by the way, can still be blocked out of combat through a challenge or something like that. Those people who hated elves who had always strikes first might be happy to see that the 9th Age does not use something like that. Elves and other magic items grant have abilities called lightning reflexes, which is somewhat similar, but instead of rerolling to hit, you just get +1 to hit. 8th edition used to have something called Killing Blow, where if you rolled a 6 on the roll to wound, you automatically killed something if it was of a certain troop type. Nothing like that exists in 9th Age. Lethal Strike is somewhat similar. If you roll a 6 and roll into wound, they do not get an armor save, and they cannot take a regeneration save, but it only does 1 wound. Also in combat, challenges. One thing that really speeds up the game that I really like is you don't move characters at all when it comes to challenges. I issue a challenge, you accepted, great, let's fight it. Just leave them where they are. If you pound somebody in the dust, you'll get all the wounds that they had on their profile that you took away from them, plus you can get up to 3 overkill. Let's see, if somebody refuses a challenge, again, you don't move them to the back rank. That used to be a way that if somebody issued a challenge, the other person could refuse, and they could take a squishy character and hide them. And I know Warriors of Chaos players used to get really frustrated when people did that against them. Now, if you refuse a challenge, nobody moves. You can still be attacked. It's just that your opponent, whoever issued the challenge, can nominate one of your characters, can't be a champion, and that character cannot attack, it cannot use its leadership, and if it's a battle standard bearer, it cannot add its +1 to the combat nor give the reroll for the break test. So there are definitely more disadvantages to refusing a challenge. Also in combat, there is no more insane courage. That rule does not have its place in the 9th Age. If the combat resolution gets to a point where double ones are not enough, then it's just a situation where there's an auto break. Also, standard bearers, including your battle standard bearer, when they flee from combat, they do not automatically die. They lose their standard, but the points, the model is still there. And after combat, there are no more post-combat reforms. You can do combat reforms when everybody's in combat, but if you win combat and you decide not to pursue your opponent, you can pivot, but you can't reform. I found that speeds the game up as well. I'm not saying that's why the rules were written the way they were written. I don't know the reason why, but I'm telling you from my perspective what the one benefit of it is. So I'm listing this under combat. It affects things other than just combat, but fear and terror work a little bit differently here in the 9th Age than it did in Warhammer 8th Edition. Number one, fear is not nearly as common as it was. Certainly, there's no army-wide, demons, vampire covenant, undying dynasties, ogres. Armies that in 8th Edition where the similar army had army-wide fear, you won't find it in 9th Age. When something does have fear, an enemy in base-to-base contact with it will have -1 leadership automatically. So that can be huge. If I have a character or something that causes fear and I get charged by something that causes terror, I do indeed have to take a terror test. Now in Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition, you didn't. The way they played it, it was almost like a 2-tiered system. Like tier 1 is fear, tier 2 is terror, and to cause a terror test, you had to be 2 tiers above whoever you were charging. So a fear causer was only 1 tier below a terror causer, so they wouldn't have to take a test. It just doesn't work like that. If you cause terror and you charge something that doesn't cause terror, as long as it's not immune psych, they have to take a terror test. Once you're in close combat, a model that causes fear does not have to take a fear test against a model that causes terror. Again, that made sense in 8th edition because it was kind of on this tiered system, and it says, well, fear is less than terror, therefore you have to take a fear test. In the 9th Age, the only thing that causes a fear test is fear. Terror causers do have fear, but fear causers are immune to the effects of fear, so in combat, fear causers do not have to take fear tests against terror causers. That is a subtle but could be an important distinction right there. Some weapons rules changed. Let's see. If you take hand weapon and shield, you get parry. And in Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition, parry meant you had a 6-up ward save. In the 9th Age, it means that you cannot be hit on better than a 4-up. Now you actually can be if they have some kind of special rule that affects it that gives a bonus to hit. I mean they can still get that bonus, but the base line that you're going to get on is limited to a 4-up. So that makes parry really, really good for really low weapon skill troops. Where normally things would be hitting them on a 3, at least they're protected that much. Spears are much, much different than in Warhammer 8th edition. Spears back then, I believe, allowed fight in extra ranks, and that was about it. In the Ninth Age, they have Armor Piercing 1. You still have fight in extra ranks as long as you didn't charge. And you have Lethal Strike versus Cavalry, Monstrous Cavalry, and Chariots as long as they're charging into the front of those spears. So Lethal Strike, again, doesn't mean you're going to kill those things outright. It means that if you roll a 6 when rolling to wound, they cannot take an armor save against it, which is pretty sweet. Okay, flails have +2 strength, which is the same as what Warhammer used to have. But when you use a flail, your opponent gets an extra +1 when trying to hit you, to their good, to your bad. So, so flails have a positive and a negative associated with them. And then paired weapons, not only do they give you an extra attack, they also give you an extra pip and initiative, which is a reason why that is one reason why I take them a lot. Sometimes I wouldn't take them. I don't think the points may or may not be worth it for the extra attack. But when I think, oh wait, that gives me an extra pip and initiative, that means there are times when I get to swing first. I find it worth it. Other changes. Units that flee from combat, if they are at 25% or less, or if they're fleeing for any reason, I guess. If they're 25% or less than their starting size, then in Warhammer Fantasy 8th Edition, you had to have to roll Snake Eyes in order for them to rally. In the Ninth Age, they rally on their leadership cut in half, rounded up. Flammable, as a special rule, means that you get to reroll to wounded if you have flaming attacks. Whereas in 8th edition, if you wounded, you got 2 wounds instead of 1. And flaming attacks ignores regeneration saves, but they don't remove it. So it used to be that I'd have my flaming Bretonnian archers shoot at a monster that causes regen. If they did 1 wound, then the monster wouldn't have regen for the rest of the shooting phase. That was Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition. 9th Age doesn't do that. Basically, if you have flaming, you can ignore regen, but of course it still has regen for anything happening later on in that phase. And that's it for this video. So, like I said, for rules that you think are important that I missed, please leave a comment below, and I'll probably make a follow-up video to this to list even more ways that the 9th Age rule system is different than 8th edition to help players who are trying to make that transition make it a little easier. Hope this is helpful.